Hello, welcome to another English Sparkling with Tweedy video. Surprisingly warm day. This must be getting on for 25 degrees. Feels like summer already and we're still only not yet halfway through May. The heath is an absolute throng. It's a Saturday afternoon, which I suppose is always a slightly worse time than coming here in the week, but there we go. Today, a bit of an unusual wine. This is the last in that case of 6 that I bought from Grape Britannia, and it was a bit of a wild card, if I'm honest. I sort of just threw this in at the last minute to sort of fill up. I always like to get a nice round 6 bottles. I don't think I'd heard of this wine or this producer before. Squirrels it's called. What does it say? Quality Sparkling Wine 2015. I think the fact that it says Wine of England rather than English Sparkling means it perhaps doesn't adhere to the PDO, PGI, whatever. The grape composition is what's probably most unusual about it, because it harks back to the early days of English sparkling wine. There's probably no point showing you that with this camera, as it's not going to focus. But it is those, I think they're Germanic grapes that were much used in the early days, and we're talking sort of 1970s and perhaps even slightly earlier, of English wine. The very first sort of glimmer of the English wine renaissance before anyone really took it seriously. I hope that doesn't sound too unfair, but I think it's probably accurate. So the grapes are Müller-Thurgau, Huxelrebe and Reichensteiner. As I say, the names all sound pretty Germanic, don't they? And they were grapes that in the early days of this English wine renaissance were found to grow reasonably well in the English climate without a lot of extra sort of tweaks that were later required to get the champagne grapes to grow successfully. They're not exactly household names, are they? Perhaps they are in parts of Germany, I don't know, but you know, these aren't really wines that people would ask for in a wine bar. Do you have any Huxelrebe? Do you have any Müller-Thurgau? Probably mispronouncing that, aren't I? But whatever the pronunciation is of it, I doubt it is a wine that anyone particularly asks for. But at one time, these were stalwarts of English wine. Part of what caught my eye about this is that at least some part of the winemaking here was done by Dermot Segru. This was presumably during the era that he was still at Whiston. He's now just purely doing his own thing, but he did a lot of contract winemaking. And I think I've tried most of the wines that Dermot Segru made for other producers while he was at Whiston. I think they run into double figures. There's quite a few. Digby was one of his. East Meon is one of my favourite. The list goes on. There's plenty of them. And it's a 2015 vintage, so it's a relatively old. It's getting off a decade old, this. The Dermot Segru connection sounds very promising. I tend to like just about everything he does. Going to be interesting to see how that works with those Germanic grapes. Shall we open this up, see what it is like? In case you're interested, that is the state of the cork. Completely natural cork there. It has gone very, stayed pretty narrow at the end. That sometimes seems to happen with these slightly older corks that have been there for a while. The mousse also dissipated relatively quickly, but there is still a healthy stream of bubbles. Very yellowish colour there, isn't it? I don't know if that's perhaps just the light today. The sun's relatively bright, although it is shining through the trees. And what do we have on the nose? This is all quite unfamiliar territory for me. I'm sure I've had once or twice before these old school English wine grapes, Müller-Thurgau, Reichensteiner, etc., whatever they're called. But it's been a while, and they were probably as a still wine, I think. Don't recall I probably have at some point had a sparkling made with these. So at the first nose, it's relatively subtle, but I do almost feel like there's a slight hint of something a little bit tropical there. It's not exactly pineapple like the Court Garden I was having the other day. That seems to be a signature of Court Garden. But there is a vague hint of, you know, when you buy that tropical juice from the supermarket, and it's probably mostly apple, isn't it, in reality, because filling up a 1 litre container with crushed passion fruit would probably be prohibitively expensive. So it's some more domestic, boring fruits. Well, boring apples can be fantastic, one of my favourite fruits, but, you know, some more mundane, ordinary, less exotic fruits like apples, and then just sort of hints of passion fruit, guava, mango, pineapple, whatever else. A tiny bit reminiscent of that, I would say, before giving it a swirl. So perhaps a bit of aeration. See how that develops. More of the same, slight hint of tropical fruit, but possibly on top of a baseline of more familiar apple and so on. And I also feel like I get a slight hint of something custardy there, something slightly creamy custardy. So even though it's not pineapple, it's sort of slightly reminiscent of a pineapple upside down cake with a layer of custard or something like that. Can't pin down exactly what tropical fruit I'm detecting there, but some sort of mix. Well, I mean, that's not a terrible start. It's a little bit subtle, a little bit faint though. Met initially with some extremely welcome, because this is unfamiliar territory, trademark Dermot Segru zing, which I'm very happy about here, because at least it's something I'm starting to recognise in an otherwise very unfamiliar wine. Really bright, classic Dermot Segru zing. He does love his acidity, doesn't he, that Dermot? And there is definitely more fruit character there, which I'm again struggling to describe. I think there probably are notes of apple, but once again, sort of hints of something tropical. Actually, those first couple of sips, I would say, coming across as reasonably sophisticated, actually. I would always imagine those Germanic grapes turned into a sparkling wine, traditional method sparkling wine, would end up being a bit sort of interesting, but kind of rustic and sort of amateur hour of traditional method. But I think if you'd passed me that and told me it was, let's say, predominantly Chardonnay, I think I might have just about believed you. It's a little bit different. There's, you know, there's those tropical notes and things which are a bit unusual, but as I said, Court Garden manifests with a bit of pineapple, so it's not completely unheard of. There is a nice bit of that, again, Dermot Segru-esque, probably because most of his wines are in and around the South Downs. I don't know if it's him or his terroir, but a bit of minerality there. Little bit of sort of bitter, botanical sort of complexity. That's pretty subtle. That's another thing I sometimes find in Dermot wines. And again, that zing is really good, and it's pretty mouth-watering. And it all comes together pretty nicely. There is fruit character there, struggling to describe it, but it's not unpleasant either. And it's zingy and refreshing and mouth-watering. I actually think that's pretty decent. And, you know, maybe it's damning with faint praise to say that I wouldn't know that it was made with those grapes, because the winemaker might actually want this to be something kind of unique and different. But I think this actually sits pretty comfortably in amongst the canon of English sparkling wines and doesn't seem too weird and unusual. I'm pretty happy with that, to be honest. I think it was also a bit cheaper. I can't remember the price I paid for it. I'll put that on screen, but I've seen this elsewhere at about £25. Anything under 30 seems good for English sparkling. I've noticed that's the theme, actually. Whenever wines don't use the classic champagne grapes, the prices seem to come down. I'm not sure if that's down to the fact that those grape varieties are easier to manage. I'm sure they're not vastly easier to manage. I'm sure there's still quite a lot of pruning and everything else that goes on as usual. I know some of those varieties are a bit more disease resistant, so perhaps the spraying programs or whatever else are a little bit more light touch. They're a bit hardier, but it's not going to be drastically, it's not going to be a huge cost saving, I wouldn't have thought, compared to the classic champagne grapes, but who knows? It might just come down to marketing. It might just be that there is a sort of cachet with Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier that people expect to pay more like champagne prices, and when you present somebody with something a bit weird like Miller Turgau, it sounds more like a yoghurt with a fruit corner, doesn't it? Maybe that's the comparison, rather than what was I talking about, pineapple upside down cake and custard. Perhaps this is a Muller fruit corner, but with an interesting compote of something tropical in the corner, rather than the usual strawberry jam or whatever you get. Although all of that said, yoghurty notes are usually not a good thing in English sparkling, because that can often be an indicator of a fault, like lactobacillus. Definitely not yoghurty. There was a pleasing hint of creaminess there on the nose, which I absolutely liked. And I think that's possibly an autolytic thing, or possibly something to do with the way that the wine was aged. Really not bad. Pretty happy with that. I think that will do me for sitting here in the woods, hopefully being undisturbed for a bit, enjoying this very pleasant spring afternoon with a nice bit of shade, sounds of the bird song and so on, and fingers crossed no bloody humans for a bit. Cheers.